Toni Lyn is a program manager for the Northeast Climate Science Center, and prior to that position, Toni Lyn was a research ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station and the lead author of the Climate Project Screening Tool. And Toni Lyn holds a Ph.D. in ecology and evolution and a bachelor's in zoology. And I want to thank Toni Lyn for joining us today, and welcome. So Toni, if you want to take it away and share your desktop. There you go.
All right. Thanks a lot, David. And yeah, thanks to you and to the C3 group in general for inviting me, giving me this chance to share the Climate Project Screening Tool with you. And thanks to everyone who showed up at their computers. As David said, I worked with the Forest Service in California. I also did a National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellowship at UC Berkeley looking at climate impacts on montane mammals, particularly in California. So I'm very familiar with the western U.S., even if I am now situated out in Amherst. I wanted to acknowledge my co-authors on the general technical report and more importantly, just on the CPST in general, people that came before me to develop it and helped along the way, particularly Connie Millar, who's at Pacific Southwest Research Station and was my supervisor there. Just briefly about the Northeast Climate Science Center, since we're fairly new, so people might not be too familiar with it, although out there you probably know your own Climate Science Center better. The Climate Science Centers are part of a federal network of now 8 CSCs that were created to provide scientific information, tools, and techniques that managers and other parties interested in land, water, wildlife, and cultural resources can use to anticipate, monitor, and adapt to climate change. Our particular Northeast Climate Science Center covers a wide geographic range, most of the Midwest and Northeast, and even 41% of the U.S. population. And we're now developing our 5-year science plan, but we know that some of our focus will be on the effects of climate change on water resources, on land use and land cover change, and on sea level rise. And so we're excited to be looking to your region and others for what has already been done and making and drawing on collaborations across the country. But today, talking about the Climate Project Screening Tool, this was a product of the West-Wide Climate Initiative. And the WWCI was a research management partnership of research stations and national forests designed to develop the decision support needed by the Forest Service in particular to incorporate climate change into management and planning in the western U.S. So we produced peer-reviewed literature and reports, white papers, communicated through trainings, other publications, and then also the Climate Change Resource Center on the web that I'll show you a bit later. The primary PIs are listed there. They came from the Rocky Mountain Research Station, Pacific Northwest, and the Pacific Southwest Research Station. But we had a lot of collaborators also in the National Forest System, including in the Pacific Northwest. And the main output of the West-Wide Climate Initiative were tools. And so we thought of it as this climate toolkit project. And so one of those tools, of course, is what I'm going to talk to you about today. The West-Wide Climate Initiative was really more based on adaptation than mitigation. And just in case you're not familiar with thinking about those terms in contrast, just put up a definition of adaptation here for you. Adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli or their effects, which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. I say here that it's a critical means of addressing climate change. It's particularly important because, as they say, we know that we have changes already occurring and more in the pipeline. And so adaptation will be necessary even if tomorrow everything, we decrease our carbon output and we're no longer increasing the changes in the climate. You can think of adaptation tactics as throwing rocks down so polar bears don't drown, but there are, of course, things that I'll be telling you about today that are practical ideas that the managers we worked with came up with and are already using in the field in the western United States. And I'm hoping that at the end of my presentation we can talk a bit more about other ideas you already have or questions you have. I'm going to keep my presentation fairly short because one of the objectives of this is just to get your feedback on how this CPST could be more useful and what you do need out there. And so speaking of thinking about management issues in the context of climate change, I listed 4 things here that I feel like are sort of 4 general boxes of what is needed. And you might quickly realize that this isn't just in the context of climate change, but that's what we're here talking about today. First, the idea of assessment. So what are the effects of climate change on threatened and endangered species, on your ecosystem, on your forest that you're working on right there? And I'm an ecologist. I feel like this is where this is the true sticking point, and I feel like that's what came out was one of the major conclusions out of this climate project screening tool pilot exercise, was to say that the scientists need to be working harder to get these answers because that seems to be a very large limiting factor. But once that is understood, how changes will be affecting species and ecosystems, that mostly that's produced in peer-reviewed publications that are scattered and very narrow, and realizing that resource managers have very limited time to be doing gathering up this information and forming summaries. That second step, translation, becomes really important, and that's something that we focused on as the Westwide Climate Initiative, and I'm now doing again, working with the Northeast Climate Science Center. So the idea being, we don't have as much information out there as we need. Even the information out there that we need, though, is diffuse and hard to easily access. So that's an important step with these federal and other partnerships like C3, like the CSCs, where we're able to join research and management to communicate these answers. The topic of uncertainty is always there in the back of people's minds and on the front of their lips, and it's something that we thought a lot about and we continue to think about at the Science Center. I actually found that I think we scientists tend to talk about uncertainty as if it's a brand new thing. And my understanding is that resource managers are dealing with uncertainty every day and every week and every year because they never really know when the first snow is going to fall or what the fire season is going to be exactly. With climate change or without, regardless, there's always variability and there's always uncertainty. And so our resource managers are constantly managing in a climate of uncertainty. And I think there are strategies that have been developed to make that possible. And so trying to just couch the uncertainty of climate science, which can seem really intimidating and complex, into the uncertainty that is already being dealt with, I think is the best solution there. That's something that a lot of people are trying to work on. And then finally, just wrote in practicalities here because, again, limited resources, both in time and money and staffing, mean that there's only so much that can get done. And that's something that we really came out of this exercise as well. And so that's something to keep in mind. But in the end, will have to be a priority setting process that happens most likely on the management end. So to start talking about the climate project screening tool, which I will be referring to as the CPST, I wanted to tell you a bit about the thinking behind it and sort of the framework, and then I'll present the actual document to you. One of the important things to note about the climate project screening tool is that it's just generally a documented review of ongoing or near-term projects to ensure that climate change is considered. And I've highlighted documented here because it can then, this document, this written account of what was considered can then be used in future discussions and in future decisions. In fact, the Forest Service is now using this climate change performance scorecard. You can see it says to be completed annually by each national forest or grassland. And number 3 there is essentially where the CPST falls in. Does the unit have written guidance for progressively integrating climate change considerations and activities into unit level operations? And so this is the kind of place, at least for the Forest Service, and of course this tool is not just for the Forest Service, but clearly where I would be most familiar, where for the Forest Service this fits in best. So the CPST helps to begin the discussion of how a project might impact climate change or how climate change will impact the project. It addresses ongoing or near-term projects that would benefit from review for consistency with adaptation goals. Allows you, to document whether or not climate change was considered and whether or not the project had been modified to adapt to aid in climate adaptation efforts. And it can act as an audit or review tool to remind managers to consider climate change in current and impending projects. The idea being that as you go through and review a project, you can then potentially modify it either before it rolls out or in its next iteration. Another important function of the climate project screening tool is that it serves as a review of priorities among current projects. So project goals and treatments might not need modification, but climate concerns might trigger changes in resource allocation. And then finally, some projects as originally designed might be deemed inappropriate altogether given climate projections or predictions, and these would be recommended for comprehensive redesign or even removal from activity lists. One big conclusion we found from our work with the CPST and our piloting of it is that it's really process-oriented. So the activity of going through the questionnaire is as important as the answers themselves in some ways. In considering the general implications of climate change for their resource area, staff brainstormed how these climate change effects would manifest at the project site and reassess the assumptions and objectives they use to determine current practices. So that was an exciting and kind of unexpected view. So what the heck is this CPST? in some ways it's just a table. In case you haven't had a chance to see it yet, there's a little microscopic picture. You're not expected to read that. But it basically splits out into a list of trends for that region, and then a table that lists the project activity, key questions, and then areas to fill in. So I have here, starting to kind of go through the table itself, or the CPST itself. I have here listed general climate change trends that we had come up with for the Inyo National Forest. So you can see the Inyo is here in southeast California. And it was one of the forests that we piloted this tool on. So we went through the literature and summarized some of the expectations. There's some really good climate research happening in that area, so we were able to get pretty good data for what was expected for that area going into the future, given climate change projections. And so there's things listed here: increased interannual variability in precipitation against generally warming average temperatures, reduced snowpack, longer, drier summers, increased likelihood of severe flood events. Thinking about longer fire seasons and atypical fire seasons, so like winter, early spring. Increased fuel buildup and risk of uncharacteristically severe and widespread forest fire and traditionally fire-prone forest, woodland, and shrub types. Higher elevation insect and disease and wildfire events. So you can see there's a big list here, and that some of these are very likely relevant for where you're at, and some would be different. And so this part of the tool would need to be modified for each forest or each management unit that is being considered. So then, to move into the next and the main part of the tool, I'm just going to pull up the actual document. And so I think you did get this. We have it set up as just a Word doc where you can fill in responses here. And you can see that there's just a quick introduction, and then the trends that are listed here again. These are not meant to be general for the whole country, but to be pulled from the literature, and that's explained here. And then we have listed some project activities. So we started with thinning for fuels management and listed specific trends and local impacts expected in this particular project area. And so we try to do this for all of the main project activities that were relevant to the two pilot forests that we were working with, and in general that we could think of. But it's not an exhaustive list. So you then can, the team, and I should back up to say that this idea here is not necessarily just have one person working on this. Ideally, you have a team, two or three people or whatever is possible. But when we were doing this as a pilot, we were working with managers, but it's great. It's not absolutely not necessary to have an external person come in, but it is good to have a conversation come out of it, and so that you're going through these and thinking about the questions out loud. We found that actually made for more effective and deeper thinking about some of these questions. So you can see these different activities listed in this region. And I note in the report, but some of the language here is used as the language that's used on the Forest Service, which is not to say that it's the best or suboptimal or whatever, but it's the language that was familiar to the managers we were working with. I just point that out because the word restoration can be a bit controversial. So that's the tool right there, and I have a few examples where people went through and filled things out. So I was sitting with them and talking to them about a particular project. So under this sort of stream restoration activity category, you can see this meadowfish. There's the name of a meadow, but I just cut it out. Habitat enhancement and drift fence. So that's the name of this particular project. And so you could imagine under stream restoration project activity, there could be 5 different activities, projects that are happening in that forest or in that management unit. And so then there are the trends and local impacts listed. And then the questions. And so we've developed questions that are relevant for the area. Thinking about what is the future range of flow, will the hydrologic system change? And you can see that then they went through and answered the specific questions. And so you go through and you answer all of these questions. And in the end, the idea is to have gone through a lengthy enough process of thinking and writing and looking up these trends and putting together a quick but comprehensive review of this project in the context of climate change, and then to say, will you continue with the project? If yes, with modification or just as it is. There's one more example I have here. This is a recreation example. Again, you can see, so this is where the answers are filled in and corresponding to the questions here. And so thinking about in terms of recreation planning, this was a bit more general. There wasn't a specific project they were thinking about. But they had taken what we had written in terms of trends and added some things in. And also just some thinking about questions that maybe they should be thinking about. And so going through the whole process, and actually this was an interesting conversation because this person in particular said, well, why aren't we talking about mitigation? There's all these ideas I have about mitigation and sustainability. And that was great. So we actually ended up adding a little section on mitigation, and although the CPST is primarily focused on adaptation, it could pretty easily be modified to think about mitigation instead and sustainable operations. So, as I've mentioned, we went through and piloted the tool on 2 forests, the Tahoe National Forest and the Inyo National Forest, interviewing 13 staff, some in pairs or some one-on-one, and going through specific projects, working through the table. And I did find, and I'll come back to this, that most discussions quickly generalized to similar future projects instead of talking about the one that was on the current schedule of proposed actions. Then more recently, David Schmidt from the Nature Conservancy, along with Region 5, conducted meetings for about 4 months. He met with hundreds of biologists and managers in Region 5. I think all of the Forest Service biologists in Region 5. And went through and showed them the climate project screening tool and talked to them through the process and got a lot of feedback from them. And also there were other groups like Nature Conservancy and Sierra Forest Legacy that gave feedback. So we have gotten quite a bit of feedback at this point, and just to share some of what we found, first from the pilot studies, specific recommendations came out of it that was interesting. So we were finding certain people saying the same things, even on different forests, and talking about problems like there's, particularly in Eastern California, there's a problem of lack of fuels market and thinking about fire in higher elevation areas. And so there were these different general recommendations we were able to pull out from this process. So this is on fire management and, for example, talking to the public about the fact that there will be more fires in the future and how can we handle that, especially at the wildlife-urban interface. On the topic of restoration or ecosystem and species management, other general recommendations that came out. And so some of this was really exciting because as these ideas are bubbling to the top, as people that are working with these species and ecosystems and issues day in and day out, and they're already seeing changes, they're thinking about how to handle them, even if maybe the projects are not yet explicitly talking about these things. So I can go back through some of these specifically at the end if you want, but they're just examples. Okay, so I thought I would give you the positive feedback before I give you the more lengthy critique, but I guess that's what you get when you ask for suggestions. So we heard back that in general people liked it. They thought it was good for documentation. It provided a platform for them to be able to write these things down and say they've thought about them and think them through. That the format worked, that some people thought maybe the columns were too narrow, or there were definitely some details in there, but in general the way it's set up was good. They pointed out that they liked the flexibility, and that came out in different ways. I've been talking about reviewing projects, but in reality a lot of this does not need to be project specific, and you can think of expanding it bigger or smaller. There's a lot of flexibility in the way it's written, and so I think that's a real advantage of this tool. As I said, it's really process-oriented. People really liked the process, and that it got them thinking about bigger questions and thinking about climate change, thinking about impacts in a way that they didn't necessarily have the paradigm or the framework to think about before, or maybe just even the time to kind of sit down and do it. Some people thought that it would be useful for NEPA and CEQA, I think that's how you say that, sorry, the California Environmental Quality Act. Although, just to move quickly to the critiques and suggestions, other people thought it was not useful for NEPA, so planning and analysis, so we kind of got feedback on both there. And I think part of that is there's some litigation issues and concerns, and it does depend on where the project's at. So one thing I mentioned earlier briefly is that because of the NEPA process, if you're looking at a project that's already been through it and approved, it's unlikely that at that point changes are going to be made. So, and similarly, if a project's right about to go. So there was a discussion to either move the review back a step, or what happened with our discussions was that projects were more generalized. So instead of talking about that one stream restoration or recreation project, we talked about stream restoration projects in general and what you would think about. Now, that's only useful if you're actually thinking about it in a certain ecosystem or at a certain elevation, but you can do that. And so, again, the flexibility of the CPST allows for some maneuvering, and particularly agency to agency or organization to organization, to think about where it best would fit. We had some suggestions that we should add certain sections like invasive species management, that final column that says yes, no, yes with modification, there wasn't really guidance on how many answers to the left of that would lead to you to have to change to change the project, and so that was a concern. As I already mentioned, a lot of people said it seemed better for a planning level on a larger scale. We got a lot of criticisms that it was too general, and I think that this goes along with the this last point here, which is that people ask for more information. And so I think this is where I come back to what I was saying in the beginning, that as an ecologist, I understand that the science is still very young, whether I'm talking about climate science or ecology. There's so many things to know out there, and there's so many things we don't know. And so what this climate project screening tool points out is that for managers to make these decisions, it sure would help if they had the information that they needed to make the decisions. And so they were asking, okay, well, that's great with these general climate trends, but where's my forest version or my parks version? Where do I get them for my area, my management unit? And that's a good question. It's obviously not possible for there to be enough research management liaison scientists out there to go do this at every management unit. And so it's very difficult with the limited resources that managers have to kind of get a hold of this information. There are tools out there that are helpful, and I think that those are good to look to. And I also just go back to the too general to say that one of the reasons that the tool is set up as general is because so that people can think about these questions in the context of not having perfect information. So the tool itself looks like this. It's a document, a general technical report. You can get it on Tree Search, or that's the link here at the bottom of the page. And I just wanted to point out, as I'm talking about some of the other tools that are out there, that especially in the West, it seems to me, that there are a lot of good, and I know California better, so sorry about the Pacific Northwesterners, but there are quite a few tools available to get some information so you can quickly explore climate projections for your local area. And with all the necessary caveats about uncertainty and the complexities of these climate projections, there are quite good data available. And they're probably not at the local enough scale to answer some of these questions. But the message, I think, to come out is that even if you don't have perfect information, it's important to work with the information you have and not delay until that perfect information comes out, just like managers are doing on all other kinds of topics. So a couple other sites that are great. I love this California Climate Tracker out of the Desert Resource Institute. And then the Climate Wizard, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and was actually through these workshops that were held by David Schmidt and Hugh Safford of the Forest Service. David Schmidt was working with the Nature Conservancy, and so he was presenting some of the data out of the Climate Wizard to go along with the tool. Again, important to remember that these are uncertain projections, and to remember the error around these estimates, but it's a good start. And then finally, I mentioned the Climate Change Resource Center, and just pop that up really quickly. This is actually a really great site. This is one of our main outcomes of our collaboration, the Westwide Climate Initiative. There are a lot of great resources on here. You can see that it stretches across the country, but there's a lot of things about the West on here in particular, I think, because that's where most of the main PIs that worked on it were from. And you can see you go through, and there's all kinds of literature, and they're annotated there's annotated bibliographies, and they go by topic, and you can see on the right-hand side here too. So for example, if you want to use the Climate Project screening tool and you need to say, okay, what's going to happen, what's out there, information is out there about my management unit in Oregon, you can then, on the topic of stream flow, you can start looking through some of these articles, these databases that are listed, and come up with some great information. And you can see they have a tools section as well. So with that, I think I'll pause and let people ask questions. I wanted to say here ideas because I think I'm happy to take questions, but about the tool and other general issues, but I'm also actually hoping more to ask you questions, or at least you can take this presentation as it was a general question of how you think you might be able to use this, or what modifications would be useful, or what tool are you using that you feel is similar, that is very useful to what you're doing. So from there, David, I'll let you take it.
Great. Thanks, Toni Lyn. So I am unmuting phone lines and would welcome questions and comments from folks. And also, there's a chat function in WebEx. If you prefer to type your question, you can send them directly to Toni Lyn or myself, and I can read them to her. But so I'll be quiet a little bit. Anyone have a question or comment or discussion item?
Hey, this is Stephen Handler in Houghton, Michigan. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure can. I'm from Michigan. Hi, Stephen.
Okay. Thanks for the presentation. I was wondering if you could explain again how the key questions in that worksheet are developed. Who develops those? How did you decide that was the list of essential things to prompt managers with?
Okay, great question. And are you familiar with your client? You must be if you're up in Houghton. You must be familiar with your climate group that's up there.
I'm part of it.
Great.
Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science.
I'll tell Chris I said hi.
Oh, I will. Yeah.
Yeah. So good question. And I guess the first, I have three answers. One is most of these questions were developed by my co-authors, like sort of just before I came on the project, and then I went through and said, are there things missing? And through the peer review process of the report, we kind of added some more things in the pilot process, and people said, oh, what about this question, as they were sitting. So it was really a process of development and contribution from all sides of saying these were the questions that were coming up. That said, I think it's really important that this is just a starting point. And these were questions that seemed particularly relevant to us in California. And maybe I can imagine now being in Massachusetts that there'd be very different questions, or at least some of them would be irrelevant and there'd be others added, or up in the UP. So I think that every column here is a starting point, and it would be necessary to modify all of it either through the conversation or before the tool's actually even kind of written through.
Hey, Toni Lyn, we have a question on the chat function. Isa is interested in climate change adaptation for restoration projects, such as sourcing seed from southern ecotypes. Do you have any suggestions such as those for restoration projects?
Sure. That is something that is definitely a big topic of conversation in the Forest Service. And I think, the moving seed around is one of the more extreme but potentially very important strategies for dealing with climate change in the future. And I think that we need to think about all the whole spectrum and consider the possibilities and the feedbacks that it will create. So I guess, but my short answer is I would start with the CCRC, that website I showed, and just go there and pop in those keywords and into the search box, or there's some looking around here, and I bet you would come up with some interesting articles and summaries on that.
Yeah.
David, do you have I'm trying to get my whiteboard back. It's not a big deal.
I think you need to return. There you go.
Yeah, okay.
Something like that.
Anyway, you just have to read me the questions because I don't see them.
Oh, I see. Any other questions by phone? I don't have any others on chat.
Yeah, this is Peter Galke in the Washington office. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Hi, Peter.
Great. Hi. So a question and a couple observations. My question has to do with, you mentioned that there was some concerns about litigation, so I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. And then my observations are, I think what you were just alluding to, number one is that for this tool to be effective, every unit would need to calibrate it according to where they sit on the landscape. And so they may need to calibrate it a couple different times for a couple, 3 ecosystems or what have you. So that's one observation. Second observation is it would seem that this tool is most appropriately applied at what we would call the left side of the triangle when we're doing the planning for projects, not when we're doing the NEPA for projects. So in that case, it really helps develop the initial proposal that's going to be on the landscape, and I would think by doing so there would be less litigation risk, but I'm not quite sure what the discussions were when you were out there in the field. But and then I think my third observation is that whatever can be shared to sort of shortcut the amount of work that individual units need to do to be able to calibrate it for them would be helpful, because having a time-consumptive process to go through this there's many units aren't afforded that amount of time to be able to go through and deal with that kind of level of analysis for climate change. They just are too busy to do that. So any sort of sharing that can be done to help make this process more efficient for them would certainly be of great benefit to the tool's use, I think, on the ground.
Okay, great. Thanks, Peter. So maybe I'll go backwards. I think that I completely understand. I mean, that is constantly the reiteration coming back from the forest saying, we don't have that much time. So I get that, and what we tried to do with this tool was to make something that felt doable, that you could have some finite amount of time that you sit down and answer questions. Now, I realize what I'm saying is that there's some background work you're going to have to do, and that's where I think these federal partnerships that are popping up are a great potential resource, and also any opportunity you have to bring in a little help to do a quick some poor undergrad intern or something you get a detailer is probably too much, but something that somebody can come in and knock something out. I understand this is just not, that kind of review is something that's beyond the capability of the wildlife biologist on the forest or whoever. There's just not the time. And so that working creatively, one of the kind of coups for, or benefits for Forest Service for this tool was that scorecard became mandatory now. As frustrating as I'm sure that was for some managers, this kind of process is now needed. Required is maybe too strong a word, but, and so hopefully that makes finding time for it a bit, at least more of a priority. But I understand absolutely that the easier that and faster it can be and more accessible it can be, the better. You mentioned two words that we saw in reviews, the left side of the paper or something. I kept hearing. I wasn't familiar with either of those terms because I never.
Left side of the triangle. It's the NEPA triangle that
right.
we're referring to.
And somebody and they were saying left-sided something else in another thing I read. So so this is absolutely what was suggested, is that would be a good place for it. The litigation was just mentioned briefly, and we haven't had a conversation about it, but there's just always some, when you're talking about NEPA, of course, there's some concerns, and so thinking about where is the right place for it, and that was some potential concern with getting involved where along the NEPA process. So I couldn't speak to that in any educated way, except that it was kind of coming up as a concern.
Well, anytime you start tinkering with the NEPA process, you always get some nervous folks out there. I completely understand.
Yeah. And then to your first point, I think thinking about calibrating it to different ecosystems for sure. I think that there's, at some point you can only calibrate so far because the science is only so good, whether we're talking about the projections, the downscaled projections, or we're even talking about like our knowledge of species biology. So you would want to have some different either project activities or even potentially trends for different parts on your forest. But Inyo is a pretty big forest, and we use the same trends for that area. Now, it depends how diverse it is, of course.
Right.
And so that's something to consider, and it's probably, for some forests, pretty obvious. Like some places, the Tahoe is pretty contiguous, not that diverse, I think. I don't know it that well. Maybe I'm going to get yelled at. But and then there are other forests, I'm sure, where you're covering just like completely different landscapes. And so people would just kind of know inherently that, you wouldn't have the same answers or even the same questions for these two areas.
Thanks a lot for that. And I got to run off to another meeting, but I wanted to just make one last comment. And I think showing the value of this tool through demonstrating what kind of adjustments were made to proposals would go a long way in articulating to the field that this is really a worthwhile effort and it's worth putting the time in. And I say that because, if you go through this process and you spend a day or 2 days of IDT time, and all of a sudden all you do is just change the seed source for reforestation, or you change your density of your thinning down, to a basal area of 40 from a basal area of 80, a lot of folks won't think that the amount of time up front really wasn't warranted. So if you can demonstrate that there was some substantial adjustments and improvements made to projects through the use of this tool, I think you have a better chance of selling it to the masses.
Thank you, Peter. That's a really helpful comment.
And thank you for your time.
So, Toni Lyn, this is David. I just wanted to mention on the information gap side that the National Climate Assessment is starting to release, new chapters, both based on geography, on different sections of the country, but also on ecosystem type or issue type, such as estuaries or forests. And I think what's a little bit different this time around as they start to to get published in the next few months is the teams are making the technical reports available, so they'll be a lot more detailed than previous climate assessments, more than just that little 8-page summary. So I think those will be useful. And then also wanted to mention the landscape conservation cooperatives around the country, in addition to the climate science centers. I think a lot of agencies and units will be able to, if you contact your LCCs, you might find partners who have gone through similar assessment efforts to try to overcome that initial, data gathering synthesis phase. It can be a little daunting.
Yes. I didn't mention the LCCs. Now I'm in trouble. Yes, absolutely. Some of our major stakeholders as the Climate Science Center are the LCCs. We overlap with 4, technically 6 actually, in this region. And so we work really closely with LCCs developing our objectives, we the Northeast Climate Science Center. And on the research side of things, I'm currently working under an LCC grant in California. So absolutely, I'm glad you mentioned that. And they're still fairly new, so not everybody knows them, but they're a great place for information. Yeah,
good forum. So we have a comment from Susan. She feels that the tool would work very well in the NIFMA phase of the NEPA process with local adjustments. This would be a good documentation to put in the individual project records. We use something like this for travel/roads analysis to help us come up with proposed actions. Since this is not a decision document, there shouldn't be a concern about litigation, and the documentation will also help answer element 7 in the climate change scorecard. So that was a comment from Susan Leslie.
Thank you, Susan. Those are great comments. And, yeah, we had gotten a suggestion about exactly that in the NIFMA phase previously from someone else, too. So thank you for that. And the little clarification about NEPA. I think that, yeah.
And NIFMA is the National Forest Management Act, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's just the on the left side of the triangle, the NEPA triangle that the previous person was talking about.
Yeah.
And we just refer to it as NIFMA. That's the planning phase of NEPA.
Yeah, for the National Forest System.
Yeah, and I really think this is a good tool for to help us answer element 7 also, besides element 3. And I think that's a really hard one for us to answer, element 3. So this will be a really good tool. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Toni Lyn, is you mentioned the Word document. Is that available on the website? I didn't see it on the website.
I sent it to you when you asked for things to send to people, but I don't think it's available on the website. I can make sure it gets up there.
Yeah, I think that would be useful. Any other questions out there?
I did have one other comment. This is Susan Leslie again. I just recently attended a workshop put on by the BLM, and they're using a tool that NatureServe has, created for the vulnerability of species, and I think it could be used for adaptation as well. And it's called Vista.
Vista.
Uh-huh.
Okay, yeah, I was just looking at NatureServe's Vulnerability Index something, and I was going to add it on that list. But maybe I was looking at the same thing, and that's an acronym or something. But that's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions out there? Well, hearing none, I will just want to thank Toni Lyn for this presentation and discussion on this tool. Great job. Really nice tool. Look forward to using it in the future.
Yeah, and thank you very much, David, and to the C3 group and to everyone for the feedback. And feel free to send me an email if you want to get hold of it right away, or if you have further questions or suggestions. I would be happy to hear from you. It's morelli@ecs.umass.edu. I can't share my desktop anymore. But we can make sure that we have it in the presentation.
Great.
But yeah, it's just my last name at ecs.umass.edu. So yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.